The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally broke over the mountain village of Kessington. Elara Voss had watched the clouds thicken from her cabin window, gray and heavy, and she had spent the afternoon stacking extra firewood by her door, sensing that the night ahead would be long and cold. She was used to storms. She had lived at the edge of this village for 3 years, ever since she took over as the local healer, and she had learned that the mountains did not forgive carelessness. What she had not learned to expect was the sound that woke her just after midnight. It was a low, pained whimper, carried faintly through the wind, followed by another, and then silence. Elara sat up in bed, listening. She almost convinced herself it was only the storm playing tricks with the trees. But the sound came again, closer this time, and something in her chest tightened with the kind of instinct she had come to trust over the years of tending to broken bones and fevered children. She pulled on her boots, wrapped herself in a thick wool cloak, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind howled between the pines, and the snow fell so thickly that her lantern light barely reached beyond her own outstretched hand. She almost turned back, but then she saw them. Near the tree line behind her cabin, half buried in a drift of snow, lay 7 wolves. They were enormous animals, larger than any wolves she had seen before, with thick gray and silver coats now matted with blood and ice. Several were barely moving. One let out a weak, rattling breath. Elara's healer instincts took over before her fear could catch up to her. She knew it was dangerous. Wild wolves, wounded and cornered, could be as likely to bite the hand that helped them as to accept it. But these wolves did not snarl at her. They did not even lift their heads in warning. They were too far gone for that, and something about their stillness broke her heart more than any threat could have frightened her. She made her decision quickly. Wolf by wolf, she dragged them toward her cabin, using an old sled she kept for hauling wood. It took most of the night, her arms burning with exhaustion, her breath turning to fog in the freezing air. By the time she had brought the last of them inside and shut the door against the storm, her hands were numb, and her cloak was soaked through with melted snow and blood. Inside, by the light of her hearth fire, she finally had a chance to look at them properly. 6 of the wolves had deep gashes along their sides and legs, wounds that looked less like animal attacks, and more like something sharp and deliberate. Claws, yes, but also something else. Cuts too clean to be accidental. Elara did not have time to wonder about that. She moved from one wolf to the next, cleaning wounds with warm water and herbs, wrapping torn flesh with strips of cloth, forcing droplets of broth between their teeth when they were too weak to lift their heads and drink on their own. The 7th wolf worried her the most. He was larger than the others, a huge gray wolf with a jagged white scar cutting across his muzzle, clearly from some old injury long healed. His wounds were the worst of the group, a deep gash along his shoulder, and another across his ribs that had bled heavily into the snow before she found him. She worked on him longest, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, murmuring softly the way she always did to frightened animals, though she doubted a wild wolf could understand comfort in a human voice. But this wolf was different. Every time she leaned close to check his wounds, his eyes opened, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause. They were pale gray, almost silver, and there was something in them that did not belong in an animal's gaze. Not menace, not fear, something closer to awareness, as if he understood exactly what she was doing and why. She told herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She had been awake far too long, working far too hard, in cold that could make anyone imagine things. But even as she finished bandaging his shoulder and pulled a blanket over his massive frame, she found herself glancing back at him, unable to shake the feeling that he was watching her long after she looked away. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through her window, all 7 wolves had stabilized. Their breathing had steadied. The bleeding had stopped. Elara allowed herself, finally, to sit back against the wall near the fire, her body aching, her eyelids heavy. She thought, just before sleep took her, that she had never worked so hard to save lives that could not even thank her. She did not know, as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, that the truth of what she had done was far greater than she could have imagined. The 7 wolves were not ordinary animals. They were the personal guard of Kale Ashriver, Alpha King of the Thornwood Pack, a lineage of shapeshifters who had ruled the northern territories for generations, hidden from human eyes by choice and by necessity. Kale and his guard had been traveling through the mountains on a diplomatic journey, meant to secure peace with a neighboring pack, when they were ambushed by rivals seeking to weaken Thornwood's rule. The attack had been vicious and sudden. Kale's guard had fought to protect him, taking wounds meant for their king, while Kale himself had been struck hard enough to prevent him from shifting back to his human form. Weakened, bleeding, and unable to lead his men to safety in any other way, he had done the only thing he could. He had guided his surviving guard through the storm in his wolf form, searching for any sign of shelter, any flicker of light in the endless white. That light had been Alara's cabin. As dawn broke fully outside, warmth from the fire finally reached deep enough into Kale's body to allow the change to begin. It happened slowly, the shift back to his human form, muscle by muscle, bone by bone, a process that would have been agonizing even without his injuries. Fur receded into skin, paws lengthened into hands. By the time Alara stirred from her uncomfortable sleep against the wall, blinking against the morning light, she did not find a wolf watching her. She found a man. He lay where the wolf had been, wrapped in the same blanket she had placed over him hours earlier, his shoulders still bandaged, his gray eyes, the very same eyes, open and fixed on her with quiet, careful attention. Alara did not scream. She did not run. She simply stared at him for a long moment, her healer's mind working through what she had just witnessed, with the same steady calm she applied to any unexpected wound or fever. Then she said, in a voice hoarse from exhaustion, "You're going to need someone to look at that shoulder again, if you keep lying on it wrong." It was not the reaction Kale had expected. He had braced himself, in the moments before the shift completed, for fear, for panic, perhaps even for her to reach for a weapon. Instead, this small, exhausted woman with dark circles under her eyes and dried blood on her sleeves was scolding him about his posture. "My apologies," he said, his voice rough. "I did not intend for you to see that. I didn't intend to spend my night dragging wolves through a blizzard, so I suppose we're both dealing with surprises." She rose stiffly, crossing to check on the other 6, who remained in their wolf forms, sleeping deeply near the fire. "Are they going to change too?" "Not until they've healed enough. The shift takes strength. Right now, sleep serves them better." She nodded, accepting this with the same practicality she accepted everything else, and returned to check his shoulder, despite his protests that he could manage on his own. "You could have bled to death managing on your own," she said simply, unwinding the bandage to inspect the wound beneath. "Let me finish what I started." He introduced himself only as Kale, offering no title, no mention of kingdoms or thrones. He told her he and his companions had been traveling and were attacked by bandits in the storm, a simplified version of the truth that left out everything that mattered. Alara accepted this explanation without much question, too tired and too focused on her work to press for details that were, in her mind, none of her business anyway. Over the following days, as the storm passed and the wolves slowly began to heal, Kale found himself reluctant to leave. He told himself it was only prudent to wait until his men were strong enough to travel, but he knew, even as he thought it, that this was only part of the truth. The larger truth was harder to admit, even to himself. He had never met anyone like Alara Voss. In Thornwood, everyone who spoke to him did so with careful reverence, weighing every word, watching every expression for signs of his mood or favor. Even those closest to him rarely spoke to him as simply a person rather than as their king. But Alara treated him exactly as she treated everyone who came through her door, with brisk efficiency, gentle humor, and an honesty that never bent to flatter him. She argued with him about how much rest his shoulder actually needed. She teased him gently when he complained about her herbal remedies tasting bitter. She never once seemed impressed by him, and somehow, that was more compelling than any admiration he had ever received. For her part, Alara found herself equally drawn to him, though she did not examine the feeling too closely. She told herself it was simply curiosity, the natural interest anyone might feel toward a man who could transform into a wolf, and had said almost nothing about his life beyond his name. But she began to notice things, the careful way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, the quiet gratitude in his voice each time she checked his wounds, the surprising tenderness with which he handled his 6 companions, speaking to them in low tones, even while they remained in their wolf forms, as though comforting soldiers rather than commanding them. On the 5th day, the 6 wolves finally shifted back to their human forms, revealing themselves as Kale's guard, strong, weathered men and women who greeted Elara with deep bows and words of thanks, so formal they made her uncomfortable. It was in watching their behavior toward Kale, the way they deferred to him instantly and completely, that Elara began to suspect there was more to him than he had told her. Her suspicions were confirmed later that same day, when a rider arrived at her cabin, a tall woman with sharp eyes, who dismounted immediately and dropped to one knee before Kale in the snow. "Your Majesty," the woman said, "we feared the worst when you did not arrive at the border meeting. Thornwood has been searching every mountain pass for word of you." Elara, standing nearby with a bundle of clean bandages in her hands, went very still. Kale closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing for her reaction, before turning to face her. "Elara," he said carefully, "there is something I should have told you sooner." She looked at him for a long moment, processing this new information with the same steady calm that had carried her through every strange event of the past 5 days. Then, to his surprise, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. "You could not mention you were a king," she said, "while I was picking ice out of your fur?" Kale let out a startled laugh, the first true laugh she had heard from him, warm and unguarded. It did not seem the most pressing matter at the time. "No," she agreed. "I suppose bleeding to death in the snow does take priority." She shook her head, though there was no anger in it, only a kind of wondering amusement at the strangeness of the past several days. "A king, in my cabin, eating my soup and complaining about my bandages." "The soup was excellent," he said. "The bandages, admittedly, could be gentler. You're welcome to find another healer next time you're bleeding in a snowstorm." "I do not believe I would want to." The words settled between them with more weight than either had intended, and for a moment neither spoke, the truth of what had grown between them in these 5 strange days finally acknowledged, even if not yet fully named. The following morning, Kale's guard prepared the horses and supplies for the journey home to Thornwood. Kale lingered at the cabin door longer than necessary, watching Elara as she packed a small satchel of herbs for his shoulder, still healing but strong enough now for travel. "I will return," he told her, and there was no formality in his voice now, only quiet sincerity. "Not as a king in need of rescue. As a man who wishes to know the woman who looked at 7 strangers dying in the snow and saw only lives worth saving, without needing to know anything else about them." Elara looked up at him, snow beginning to fall softly outside once more, though this storm felt nothing like the last. "I'll hold you to that," she said. "Kings, I've heard, are not always known for keeping their promises. Then I will simply have to prove myself an exception." He left as the sun rose fully over the mountains, his guard riding beside him, all 6 now fully healed and human once more. Elara stood in her doorway and watched until the small procession disappeared down the winding mountain road, the snow settling quietly around her cabin once again. She did not know, standing there in the early morning light, exactly what the future held, or whether a king truly would return for a healer from a small mountain village. But she found, as she turned back into her cabin to begin the ordinary work of another day, that for the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to whatever came next, with something that felt remarkably like hope.